You said something today, maybe just morning to a stranger, maybe a whole argument about whose turn it was to do the dishes. You didn't think about it. The words just came, shaped by lips and tongue and breath, understood instantly by another mind, across a table, through a phone, from thousands of miles away. It feels automatic, almost invisible, like breathing. You've used language so many times today, you've already forgotten most of it. But somewhere, at some point, none of this existed. No words, no grammar, no way to say I, or tomorrow, or danger. Just sound and silence, and creatures who could not yet tell each other what they meant. And somehow, out of that silence, language was born. So what did it actually sound like the very first time a human opened their mouth and meant something by it? Here's the uncomfortable truth. We don't know. Not really. There are no recordings, no transcripts scratched into stone. Spoken words vanish the instant they're spoken, leaving nothing behind but the air they moved through and the memory of whoever happened to be listening. Linguists sometimes call the origin of language the hardest problem in science. And in 1866, the Linguistic Society of Paris got so tired of unfounded theorizing on the subject that they issued an outright ban. No more papers on the origin of language submitted to their society, period. Too much wild speculation, not enough evidence. That ban held, informally, in linguistic circles for over a century. But here's where it gets interesting. Even without recordings, we're not totally in the dark. We have clues, scattered across several completely different fields of science. Fossils tell us about the shape of ancient throats and skulls. Genetics tells us about the wiring tucked inside our brains. Comparative linguistics, the science of tracing living languages backward through time, lets us reconstruct fragments of speech that are, by some estimates, thousands of years old. And even psychology has something to say, through strange little experiments involving invented sounds and total strangers. Piece all of it together, carefully, and a blurry picture starts to form. Let's start with the body, because language didn't begin with a word. It began with anatomy. Around 2 million years ago, the brains of our ancestors were slowly changing shape, developing regions that, in modern humans, handle speech, sequencing, and language processing. But having the right brain isn't enough on its own. You also need the right throat. Modern humans have a larynx, the voice box, positioned unusually low in the neck. That low position creates a long vocal tract, a kind of built-in instrument capable of producing a huge range of distinct, controllable sounds. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, don't have this setup. Their larynx sits much higher, and their vocal range is dramatically more limited, no matter how much we might wish we could just teach one to talk. Somewhere in our evolutionary past, that anatomy shifted, inch by inch, generation by generation. And when it finally did, a door opened that had never been opened before. What the research doesn't tell you is exactly when that door opened all the way. Some scientists argue the anatomical groundwork was already in place with Homo erectus, potentially as early as 1.5 million years ago. Others push the timeline for fully modern, flexible speech much later, to around 100,000 years ago, coinciding with the rise of Homo sapiens as we know them today. There's even a genetic clue hiding in your cells right now, whether you've thought about it or not. A gene called FOXP2. In 2001, a team of researchers at Oxford, led by geneticist Cecilia Lai, identified FOXP2 as critical for speech and language, after studying a British family with a severe, inherited speech and grammar disorder passed down across 3 generations. Mutate this one gene, and the ability to form fluent, grammatical speech quietly breaks down. It's not the language gene, despite how it's sometimes breathlessly described in headlines, but it is a real, physical thread connecting our DNA to our capacity to talk at all. So the hardware existed, eventually, but hardware needs software. And that brings us to the sounds themselves, and to a question that turns out to be stranger than it first seems. Did language even begin with sound? Here's a fact worth sitting with. Many linguists believe it may not have. Language may have started with gesture, pointing, mimicry, exaggerated facial expressions, the kind of physical communication you still see today in a game of charades or in a toddler pointing furiously at a cookie jar. Vocal sound may have layered on top of that later, adding a channel that kept working even when your hands were full, or when it was too dark to see a gesture across a fire. Then, slowly, over an enormous stretch of time, sound took over as the dominant channel. And the very first vocabulary, if we we can even call it that, was probably not abstract or philosophical. It was practical, urgent, immediate. Words for danger, words for food, words for come here and watch out, and not that way. Nouns and warnings, not poetry. Survival first, everything else later. Now here's a study moment worth pausing on, because it's genuinely one of the more delightful findings in this whole field. In 2015, cognitive scientists Marcus Perlman and Nathaniel Clark, studying what's called vocal iconicity, ran an experiment asking participants to invent brand new vocal sounds, no real words allowed, for concepts like big, small, fast, cutting, and round. Then they played those invented sounds to total strangers, people who had never heard them before and shared no common language with the inventors. The strangers guessed the meanings correctly far more often than random chance would predict. A low, drawn-out growl tended to mean big. A quick, sharp burst tended to mean cutting. This suggests something remarkable. The very first sounds humans made to communicate may not have been arbitrary labels at all. They may have imitated the world directly. A hiss for wind, a grunt for effort, a sharp bark for danger. Sound acting out meaning, physically, before grammar ever existed to organize any of it into sentences. That idea actually has a name, and a surprisingly old one: the bow-wow theory, proposed half-jokingly by linguists back in the 19th century to describe language beginning as pure imitation of natural sounds, animal calls, rushing water, cracking branches underfoot. For decades afterward, it was mocked in academic circles as far too simple to explain something as complex as grammar. But that 2015 study, and others like it since, gave the old joke theory unexpected scientific weight. Maybe it wasn't so foolish after all. Maybe it was just early. But sound imitation alone doesn't get you all the way to language. Not the kind with grammar, tense, and structure that lets you describe things that aren't even in the room. For that, you need rules, shared, learned, and passed down carefully from one generation to the next. And this is where things get genuinely mysterious, because rules require repetition across generations, and repetition requires time, an enormous amount of it. Here's where comparative linguistics steps in, and where the picture gets a little clearer, if still incomplete. Languages change slowly, and crucially, predictably. By comparing related languages spoken today, researchers can work backward, sound shift by sound shift, to reconstruct extinct ancestral tongues, kind of like reverse engineering a family tree by studying only the grandchildren. This is how we know that Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, German, and English all descend from a single common ancestor, dubbed Proto-Indo-European, spoken roughly 6,000 years ago somewhere on the steppes north of the Black Sea. Linguists have painstakingly reconstructed hundreds of its words, including a word for wheel, which conveniently lets archaeologists date the language to sometime after wheels were actually invented. It's a small detail, but it's the kind of small detail that makes the whole reconstruction feel real. But 6,000 years is practically nothing compared to when spoken language likely began, somewhere between 100,000 and possibly 1.5 million years ago. Comparative linguistics simply cannot see that far back into the past. Languages mutate too fast, and too much gets lost, layered over, replaced entirely, generation after generation. Trying to reconstruct the first human sentence using modern languages as evidence is a bit like trying to reconstruct the smell of the very first campfire from the smoke alarm currently beeping in your kitchen. So we're left with something genuinely humbling, an origin point we can circle, narrow, and study from every possible angle, but never fully recover. We can say, with real confidence, that early language was probably built from imitative, meaningful sounds, that it likely worked alongside gesture for a long time before sound fully took over, that it needed a body capable of producing complex, controlled sound, and a brain wired specifically to organize that sound into structure and sequence. But the actual first word, the exact sound, the precise moment one person made a noise and another understood it as meaning something specific, that moment is gone, permanently, irretrievably gone. And maybe that's fitting in its own quiet way. Language, the very tool humans built to preserve memory, to pass down stories, laws, warnings, recipes, and love across generations and centuries, cannot preserve the memory of its own birth. The one thing language cannot tell us is how it began. Every written record, every myth, every ancient tablet, all of it comes far too late to catch the moment itself. Every conversation you've ever had, every argument, every joke, every "I love you" whispered at exactly the right moment, all of it traces back to that first vanished sound, made by someone whose name, whose face, whose exact words we will never, ever know. You will never hear it. No one will. But in a strange way, you're still speaking it. Every time you open your mouth, you're continuing a sentence that started somewhere in the deep, silent dark of prehistory. A sentence none of us will ever get to see the beginning of. If you don't want to miss the next mystery we dig into, subscribe now so it lands in your feed the moment it's out.